The most important thing as photographers, whether you are beginning or are professional, is to make mistakes. It's from those mistakes that we really learn. So I implore you to mess up. That's what we all should do. So once I started testing some things out, using different modifiers, different ideas of mine that kind of came through looking at all these photographs, I started to develop a little bit of a style. Now, somebody once told me long ago that as early photographers, we kind of are here and here, and as we get on in our careers, we kind of move in a bit. I've never fully moved in. I still kind of push those edges quite a bit. I shoot a very wide variety of work, which I think you're going to see in a moment. And as a result, I've kind of developed a bag of tricks, as I like to call them. And that bag of tricks allows me to solve problems, and part of solving problems is what a professional photographer does. We have to walk into situations that we are meant to be prepared for, and everything goes the opposite direction. The weather doesn't cooperate. The subject is late. You've gone from having an hour to 2 minutes to a complete change in the creative direction. You walked in expecting to go one direction, and the creative director says, you know what, I don't like this, can we do this? So these are things that you need to be prepared for as a professional photographer, and it only makes you better when you have those tricks in your bag that you can pull out at any time to solve the problem at hand. When I do get assignments, I ask a lot of questions of the person who's hiring me, and I really want to know the backstory of my subjects. Part of marrying the lighting to my subject comes with understanding what is the story I'm trying to tell here. I was a psychology major as well in college, and so I like to play both sides of it, and I like to understand a little bit about what's trying to be conveyed here aside from just whoever's standing in front of my camera. So the combination of the two elements is really what I'm looking for. A little bit of the backstory and a little bit of the mood and feel of what this is meant to be in the end result. I can't always get that. You often will ask these questions of your assignee, and you won't get an answer. I often get assignments nowadays, because staffs are limited, where nobody is going to be on set with me. So I'm going to have to make these decisions on my own. In those cases, I really do push harder to get an answer as to what are we trying to say here? What are we trying to tell? What's the story? What's the feel of this photograph that you're looking for? And based on that is where I start making my decisions about lighting. I've done this since day one, and I implore you from whether you are at day one now or you're at day 5,000, start a notebook. I've used this notebook my entire career, and I still have all my notebooks from the very beginning. All my ideas, all my lighting schemes in my head, and even sketches of concepts. So if I'm assigned to do a portrait of somebody, let's say he was a criminal who turned his life around and now is helping those he used to scam, and they want a dark, moody picture, I'm going to sketch out ideas in my book before the shoot and utilize that on set. So I'm going to show you a little bit of this, and hopefully we can zoom in a little bit for the audience outside of here. But what I've done here is basically taken these sketches, I print out small prints of the images afterwards, and I post them in. And this is a good example here of what a typical sketch is going to be. It's basically a bird's eye view of a set and where I'm going to be placing the lighting. You're going to see these in a moment. From here is I've got my blueprint for the beginning of the shoot. When things go wrong, I already have one thing less to think about. That's the most important part, is that when I've already eliminated the one thing that didn't work, that's one less thing to slow me down when I need to come up with the next solution. So that's where I've really found, even to this day, the most important aspect of doing this. Outside of that, it's a great tool for working with your client. If your client is standing there on set, you're having a conversation, and the words are just not communicating what is trying to be conveyed there. Somebody might say to me, well, I want it like this, and I can't really explain what the mood is, and sometimes I'll say, oh, like this? And then they'll say, no, 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 more like that. And that's how we start that conversation. And sometimes words just don't work for creatives. You know, sometimes we need to see things visually. That aside, as we all probably know, things go wrong on set. Maybe your computer freezes up, a light breaks, whatever. This is a great thing to hand off to your client. Say, oh, check out my notebook while I'm working on this over here. It's a good distraction. So it solves a lot of check marks in your book as far as what you can use this for. And more important than anything else, it's a reference point for you to always go back to. I have shoots that I have to do the same each year and the same exact lighting year to year. And so if I can go back after a year and look back and just check my notes and know what direction I have my lights, what power settings I used, what ISO I was set to, makes my life easier. It's a lot quicker when I get onto set. What I'd like to show you here basically is a series of images along with their setups, and talk a little bit about why I chose to light each one the way that I did. This will probably be the part where you'll get most of your questions, and I'm happy to go back to images whenever we're done with the imagery and answer anything you guys might have. So this is a designer called Yuta Powell, and this was an assignment for a Brazilian magazine. If you can imagine the smallest room you could possibly have to work in and then shrink that down another 4 feet, that was pretty much this situation. We were photographing her at her storefront, which was on Madison Avenue. And the idea was basically to just do some great portraits of this woman. She's Givenchy's former assistant. If you could just hold it to the end there.
Can you shut the lights, maybe? It'd be easier to see.
No, the lights don't get shut down, sorry. So basically, we're upstairs in the tiny room at the top of the shop, and there's really not a lot of room to do anything. If you can imagine that this is a storefront, so there's clothing racks in the store. So the background is going to be clothing racks, which really wasn't very appealing. So I found this little Japanese changing blind and decided that would make a cool background. So I set it up as close to the farthest wall I could possibly be, and then I squeezed in a medium octodome as my key. Now, in these small situations, one of the things that kind of happens is the happy accidents. And one of the happy accidents by having to forcibly put my light very close to my subject here is that you can see she's quite an older woman. This allowed for a very soft feeling to the light. And there's nothing kinder to people with a lot of wrinkles than soft, clean light. So by forcibly having to put that octodome next to her, I was able to light her in a very beautiful way so that she could look her best. And there really isn't a lot of retouching on her face here. This is more so that straight out of camera, I was able to get this. Now you'll note that I put here gold and silver inserts. PhotoFlex happens to make a octodome that has interchangeable gold and silver inserts. You can use it all white, silver and gold, you can do the mix. And one of the nice things with that is that it allows you to manipulate the temperature of the light as it comes out of the strobe box. So with the gold and silver, I get a little bit of the mix of warm and specular at the same time. Now that combination to me just is a nice combination. Whatever that ratio that happens from that is something that appeals to me. There are times, particularly let's say if I'm shooting African Americans, I might use all gold because the gold's warmth looks better on their skin. There's times where I know I'm doing an image that's only going to be black and white. I might use all silver so that I get a very specular and hard, crisp feel to it, so that contrast really can be pumped up when I go towards that. For this portrait of the owner of the meatball shop, it was a commission job that I was doing on a series of people with tattoos, and the direction was pretty much make a cool portrait. And that's, you know, kind of what I was talking about earlier with your clients, where basically you sometimes are not given a lot. And so make a cool portrait really doesn't tell me anything about what I'm going to do lighting-wise. It just says make a cool portrait. And I can push and try to get a better answer, but I'm not necessarily going to get anything better than that. Thankfully, we had a very good location. So I went a little bit early, and I was able to scout, which is not something I always get to do, but when you can, it's always great to do that. And I found this freight elevator. And in the freight, obviously, was this cool little graffiti stuff going on. It was actually, I think they had Dante's Inferno written on the walls all around it. And I chose that as my first location for this portrait. Now, nothing is ever easy. A freight elevator is a decent size, but it's not huge. So rather than be able to put stands up and everything else, I actually had my assistant jammed up against the wall with a small octodome. And the reason I did that is because the stands were going to be in the shot. So it was just easier for, yeah, we can use Photoshop, but when you're handing off an image to a client, if it's clean right out the camera, that says a lot more than an image that has, oh, we're going to fix that later in Photoshop. Those are kind of like the death words you don't want to hear. We'll fix it later in Photoshop. Sometimes, yes, you have to. But if you can avoid it, give them a clean image. So had my assistant stand up against the wall, kind of jammed him in, and just hold the light at a direction. I just would kind of say left, right, you know, point it in this direction so we'll get the angle we wanted. I wanted something moody because to me, the feeling of the kind of hard, one-sided light with a lot of mood coming would be, you know, beneficial to the idea of a quote-unquote cool portrait. So in this case, I also used the gold-silver insert. You'll see that's going to probably repeat a few times because it is something I go to a lot. And I also used both baffles. There is a removable baffle inside, and then there's the outer baffle as well. The reason I did that is because even though I was looking for a one light feel to this image, I didn't want it so hard that the shadows would be completely dark and I wouldn't have any information in them. So by softening that light, by using both baffles, I'm able to retain some of that shadow detail, and then I can always darken it. You can't always go the opposite way. You can't always lighten it once you get to the post-production. Local Heroes is a personal project, which is something that I also implore people to do all the time, especially if you're a professional photographer. We spend probably 9 out of 10 shoots are something we don't even care to be shooting. It just is sometimes for the job. So personal projects allow you to have the creativity and control things yourself and allow you to really express the way you see the world and not necessarily doing somebody else's vision. So I decided to do a series of portraits on volunteer firefighters across the country. So along with a friend of mine who's a creative director, we went to 4 different departments across the country and essentially did something which I do a lot, which is to set up a location studio. So it would be similar to walking into a room like this and having to figure out how to turn it into a photo studio. So traveling with a white seamless and not a ton of equipment because I was working alone without an assistant since it was a personal project, I decided to do things minimally. Lighting a white seamless background can be done with 2 lights, sometimes even 1 light. So I retained 2 lights for the background and 2 lights for the foreground. So traveling fairly light, didn't need a cube truck or anything like that to get there. And I wanted to keep the drama really high in these images. This is a case where I knew I'd be going black and white. And in reality, halfway through the project, we decided we wanted to do half the portraits in color. So sometimes you don't know, so you want to be covered just in case. But even with the high drama, it worked both in color and black and white, thankfully. I went with a small octodome in this case. Oops, sorry. Gold and silver inserts again. And a grid in this case, no baffles. And the reason I did that is I really wanted to focus my light on my subject in these cases. So what the grid does, for those of you who've never used them, is it essentially acts like a focus tool for your light. So whether you're using a strobe light or a continuous light, that grid will focus that light into a smaller area and not spread out as much. You may have seen some tutorials for still life photographers where grids are used to keep light off of a background, and that's a very useful tool if you are doing still life, and that same useful tool can be used when it comes to people. So I was lighting my background brighter than my foreground here in order to have that nice white, and with the Octabank focused on my subject with that grid, I was able to really just kind of put a lot of attention right to their face. And a big part of shooting on white like this, especially in black and white, was we were talking about the shapes that were created the firemen with all the paraphernalia and everything. It was really more about the shapes and less about the individual person. We were trying to tell their story, but at the same time, it was a story that we wanted to really be something that would be representational of firefighters as a whole, so that we would hopefully appeal to the country. When I create a studio situation like this, the assessment is somewhat easier versus having to incorporate the environment, because I just need to appropriate the right amount of space to do so. If I was in this room here, obviously I would just want to clear these chairs out, get rid of the table, kind of clear as much space, make it look like a studio as much as possible. In most of the cases I was in, we were limited by the ceilings just as much as this ceiling is pretty low. So when you face those situations, you do have to know how to kind of manipulate it. However, it is somewhat easier because you're not dealing with the outside elements that are in that location that are becoming a part of it. A lot of my training in that area came from shooting in New York. New York City apartments are typically pretty small, so having to compact gear into a taxi and get to an apartment and then create a studio or a location in a small New York City apartment, it was kind of a good training for me to do this when I had a room this big or when I had a small storefront room. For this portrait of NFL star Mario Williams, typical of athlete shoots, I had about 90 minutes to complete all 3 portraits and an entire gym workout for the magazine assignment. This, of course, meant that I had to work fast and know what I was going to do beforehand. Here again, comes back to the notebook. This is why I sketch these ideas out, so that when I'm on set and we're going to change sets 3 times and go to a gym environment as well, I've got notes and I've got everything ready to go. Sometimes I'll work with more than one assistant. Situations like this, I had 2, sometimes 3 assistants. I can hand them the book and say, this is the next set that we're going to do. Go start setting this up while I'm finishing up this shot. So that is, again, another use of the book. We scouted the field prior to the day, unfortunately at sunset. So I had to, and this was before iPhones had great things like Sunseeker and things like that that tell you where the sun is going to be. I had to kind of guesstimate where the sun was going to be for sunrise, which is when we did this shoot. So I knew it was going to be in the vicinity of the building in the background here. So I chose a spot, told them that's where we'd like to meet. Fortunately, the blocking mechanism in the background was there, so I didn't have to move anything. And I kind of just positioned myself where the sun would be so that I would be able to use the sun as another light. So you can see here that the sun is becoming my highlight light in the background. I then lit his face with the same small octabank. I obviously use that a lot in the gold and silver inserts. Again, going back that the gold has a nice quality to the skin and the silver gives that nice punch that I like. And in this case, I only used 1 baffle. The reason for that was for power. I was using Profoto 7Bs, which are decent in power, but I wasn't able to get enough power to overpower the sun necessarily unless I pulled one of the baffles out of that light. Now, I didn't mind that so much because it kind of matched the feel of the sun, and so it kind of balanced out that image a little bit. And then on the other side, I have a quantum turbo flash with a diffuser dome, and that's giving that other little nice highlight along the side of his face. And that's really like a subtle highlight, as opposed to the harder highlight that we get from the sun. And I try to match those things sometimes, but other times it's more about a feel, what feels right. It's not necessarily a ratio that is mathematical that has to be correct. It's more about what feels correct to you. And we have the benefit nowadays of having, these bigger LCD screens on the cameras, and I shoot to an iPad, so I can see it on an iPad, and I have blockers so that I can look at it in bright sunlight, so I can really see what's going on there, and we have big computer screens and things like that. Imagine when we were back shooting Polaroids and we had to study it off of Polaroid that's going to get, 15% darker, 25% darker as the day goes on, and you're making an assessment and then having to move. So it is much easier these days, but you do need to test these things out and get used to them to say, oh, this is what I like, this is the feel that I want, and you work towards that feel. This was another personal project that I do. This is actually the one I've been working on for 3 years and still continuing with. It's called Right Next Door, and it's essentially interesting stories of people that live all around us that you might not realize have these great stories to tell. In this case, I challenged myself to not be technical, and I approached this entire project as a non-technical shoot. I wanted to do something very simple lighting-wise, but I needed something that would be consistent because I'd be going into all these different homes and different environments and wanting to make sure that the project as a whole had one message to it as far as the lighting was concerned. Just to explain, the reason this is called Bubble Boy is because this is a writer called John Heyman who worked on Seinfeld. And for any of you who watch Seinfeld, you might remember the Bubble Boy episode. Well, the story goes that the producer of the show was trying to cast a 14-year-old actor to play this cantankerous boy who lives inside a bubble that Jerry was meant to go visit. And George ends up going and playing, what's that game? Trivial Pursuit with him, and they get in a big argument, and the bubble pops, and so on and so forth. In the episode, you only see his arm, and the reason for that is that they could not find a 14-year-old actor who had enough New York chutzpah to play the part. And Heyman, who's from New York, even though he lives in LA, was known to be a little bit of a crotchety kind of guy, and so Larry Charles, the producer, went to him and said, "Can you play Bubble Boy? Because we need somebody with some attitude." So he ended up doing it, and the reason you only see his arm is because he's quite a lot older than a 14-year-old boy, even though he's younger than this picture. So going back to the technical aspect of this shot, basically I wanted to go through these with a setup that was super simple and super reliable and somewhat something I didn't have to think about when I walked in. So again, unlike most of my shoots, I decided I'm just going to take a light into these situations and bang it into a wall, and that's it. So when I walk into their apartment or their home or whatever situation we're in, all I look for is a wall to bang my light off of, and that's it. And in some cases, I end up with some different color casts and things like that, so I had to learn some techniques in post work to get rid of some of that happens. But for the most part, I've been pretty lucky because a lot of people's homes or apartments have a white wall, and in some cases, just a white ceiling. And I basically just have the same settings across the board, which is always going to be the way that I keep it consistent as far as the look goes. And then as far as the light goes, the subtle little changes that happen based on whatever I'm bouncing it off of are so minimal that I think the general audience wouldn't necessarily know what they are. So by keeping it this simple, I'm able to walk. I actually videotape and, or sorry, I shouldn't say videotape, but I video and I photograph them in the same day or afternoon, whatever time I'm meeting them. So I'm walking in with very little equipment, and again, that's on purpose. That way I can be pretty mobile and do this wherever I need to go. To some of the subjects that I've ended outside, I basically came up with the solution of just using a single shoot-through umbrella, and it has that same kind of general feel as the light bouncing off the wall. If you think about it, that light bouncing wall, all it's doing is spreading it out, and it's just creating a little bit of shape to the photograph, and that's it. And that's all I was looking for. This is pretty typical of the commercial work I do for networks. Large cast, ton of shots, very little time. Often we don't get to scout beforehand. Sometimes we do. This one was a particular challenge in that we had to do it at 4:30 in the morning. The Jersey Shore was at its peak at the moment, and for them to be seen down in the Jersey Shore would certainly cause a commotion. So even with security on hand, we still needed to shoot early morning so that we could try to avoid any issue of crowds. The concept behind the shoot was to have the cast look like they were on their way home after a long night of partying, which, big surprise, that's what they do. I wanted to light the group well, but at the same time give the feeling of late night. So in order to do so, I decided I was going to hang a lantern, which is similar to what are used quite often in movies. They're basically a light box that you can put over either a continuous light or a strobe, and it gives the effect of a street light, which is really what I was trying to get at. And then I used two beauty dishes with aprons. The aprons kind of soften the light a little bit. And I stacked them in order to have a better spread. A single one would only spread so far, so having two stacked next to each other, I was able to get a nice even spread. And for those of you who have used beauty dishes, you'll know that the light out of a beauty dish is quite nice. So by putting two together, I was able to kind of get that nice light, but just bigger. And so that way I was able to cover the whole group. We did use some gel on this case to warm things up. Quarter CTO gel, just give a little bit of warmth to things. I don't use gels a lot, but in this case, it kind of felt like it needed it, because if you think about it, when you're out at night, there's a lot of times there's warmth in the light that's out there. The PhotoFlex medium strip bank was under camera, and I used that as a fill light. And the reason I do that, it's typically 2 to 3 stops under my key light. And the reason I do that is really just for detail. So it opens up a lot of those shadows. It puts a little bit more information in the close. And again, if we're going to go back to the catch light point, it puts a little bit of a spark in people's eyes. And so for anything that's closer than this, that little bit of life in the eyes really helps, because what's the first thing we look at when we look at pictures of people is their eyes. It's just what happens. For this photo shoot with Gray Maynard, who's a UFC fighter, this was actually my first assignment for the UFC. I'd never worked with this creative director before, and all the way leading up to the shoot, I kept trying to have a conversation with them, and it just kept not happening. And again, it's one of those things where I'm always pushing because I want to walk in prepared. We had a good budget in this. We actually had a truck full of equipment in this case, so I had everything at my disposal. It was there. So I knew that I could just pull things out of the truck if I needed to. But at the end of the day, I like to know what I'm going into. So I had some rough ideas of what I was going to do, but really I needed a conversation with that creative director. So there was a slim little minute where we were looking at the clothing. And during that period of time, I was able to pull the creative director aside and said, what are you trying to get across here? What's the feeling you want here? And after going back and forth for a couple minutes, what she essentially said was that she wanted to see something like Fight Club. Now, for those of you who have seen that movie, it's a great movie to study as far as lighting goes. Movies tell us a lot about lighting. One of the first things that I did as a photographer was to try to learn more about lighting. I went to a lecture like this, and the guy started off with a scene from Gladiator. And the reason he did that was because the lighting in Gladiator is brilliant. There's a lot of stories that are being told in that movie through the lighting. And I think that's Ridley Scott. That's his thing. He knows that he can use lighting to manipulate the viewer's perception of what's going on. And that's really what we're trying to do, right? So once she said Fight Club, then I said, okay, wait right here. I grabbed 2 medium strip banks and set them up opposite each other and tweaked in Lightroom the temperature of the file so that it would come off with a slight green cast every time. And shot 1 frame. She loved it, and that set the theme for 7 days of shooting. So that was a way that we kind of got to that place, that common place that I was looking for as far as creatively what she was looking for and the story she was trying to tell, and then how the lighting would help get that to its end point. Now, for those of you who have seen gray cinder block walls, they don't give you much. They're pretty boring and it's pretty bland. So in any case you can give it some life, whether it's through color or lighting, anything you can do is going to make it more interesting than that flat gray that it is. In a lot of the frames that we shot, we ended up streaking a grid along the wall to create an appearance of a window light going down the wall, just to break it up a little bit. So those are things that we did throughout the day to continually evolve the pictures as a lighting story. Now, again, I use that medium softbox under camera to just be a nice filler. And because this was for a clothing catalog, we actually needed a lot of detail on the clothes, and that gave me that detail. And again, I could always make it darker. I just couldn't make it lighter. For this assignment for Danskin, art director really wanted a feeling of the ballet images from the 40s and 50s. So we were looking at a lot of black and white pictures, but obviously for their purposes, because they're selling products, they wanted color in this case. So knowing that back in that time period, ballet schools often ran out of the buildings with the large vaulted windows that are, down in the East, West Village and whatnot. That was kind of that big soft light that I was looking for. But of course, we're on a location that doesn't help. We're at a theater in Red Bank, New Jersey that's completely pitch black. Now, they can turn all the theater lights on, and it gave us a bit of light, and we can direct where they're going like that. But that requires a union guy to be on set the entire time, and we got to pay him. And there's all these, things that are going to come in that are going to make it more difficult. So what can I do with my equipment that's going to solve the problem? And so essentially, knowing that I wanted to create a big daylight type feel, what I did was I took 2 large 12 by 12 one-stop silks, set them up next to each other, and then behind that, put 2 large Spanier light banks. Now, so that's soft light going into soft light, spreading out onto the subjects. And again, by having it close to my subjects, I'm keeping it on the softer side. By putting that light further away, it would get a little bit harder. So we brought it up as close as we could to them to keep it out of frame. And then because the stage was pitch black, it was eating up so much of the light, I threw in a Photoflex large octadome, which is a 7-foot octadome, also with both baffles included so that it would soften that light and spread it out a little more, add a little bit more shape to the light, and wrap it around. If you can imagine back in the day, some of those dance studios might have been on a corner, and so you'd be having most of your light coming from one side of windows and then a little bit of spillover light coming from the other side, and that's essentially what we tried to get to. For this portrait of a former Wall Street trader who turned into a restaurateur, I had, at the time, been playing around with the idea of turning day into night. And this was a little bit prior to high-speed sync, which allows us to do that a little bit better nowadays. But I knew that in order to get there, I needed to utilize a polarizer on my lens. So I put a polarizer on my lens that made, I think, a 1 or 2 stop difference in darkness. And then I would have to blast him with more light in order to get back to the exposure I wanted to get to. And so this was actually shot at, I think it was like 11 o'clock in the morning. So it was actually bright on the street at the time. And we were able to overpower the sunlight and create a very kind of dark and moody images. Unfortunately, with the lights, you can't see it as well, but there is good detail in everything. It kind of very much reminiscent of what you'd see walking down the New York City street at night with the way the street lights are and all that kind of stuff. And just to make sure that it's not a flat image, I added in a gridded light up at the top behind him and inside the restaurant, just to put a little bit of light on his hair, so you can see it just on the edge of his jacket and on his hair. And that really just gives a bit more shape to the image. And again, all I'm really looking for there is kind of that emotional quality that we were feeling when you walk down the street at night in New York City. This is another UFC fighter, believe it or not. A lot of times the assignments take you outside, which is nice, and going to do stuff with guys who want to showcase what their activity is outside of the fighting ring. And so Jim Miller, who's based in New Jersey, also does bow hunting. So we essentially went bow hunting with him for nothing, but just walking around in the woods where he would be hunting. So we were at a private game reserve, which was pretty cool that we had the run of the place to ourselves. And essentially we were just kind of creating what it would be like if you were there with him during a day of hunting. So I really just walked around and looked for interesting looking shapes and interesting looking backgrounds that I could utilize for the shots. Obviously you can see it's winter and it's a very kind of overcast, cloudy day, so I'm not getting a lot of fun light from the sky, so I'm going to have to go on my own stuff. So because we were out and about, I didn't have a lot of equipment with me. I essentially wanted to keep things simple, and I took that same small octabank that I love with the gold and silver inserts and 2 baffles to almost mimic the feeling of the light from the clouds, but give a little bit of push to it. And it's almost if you can imagine a thin cloud with the sun behind it. And that's the advantage of controlling the light ourselves, is that we can really direct it to where we want it to be. And so by having it directed right at his face, you can really see that there's great shape, and that brings your attention to his face, which is really what it's all about, right? So the other bonus of it is that it gives the nice shape to him that allows you to kind of really pull him out from the background. And he is wearing camouflage, so without lighting, you always run that risk of him blending in too much. And I actually did some shots of him without light, where he was just standing up against this same wall from the other side, and you literally can't see his clothes. And so that little bit of light, especially the fact that it was soft, gives that detail into the clothing that gives that little bit of separation that helps. This is another situation of tiny, tiny rooms. This was, this was actually photographed in a cigar smoking room up in Columbus Circle, where there's maybe 6 feet of space from wall to wall. So I'm actually physically between 2 chairs, jammed myself in with the camera, and there's no way I can move, and I just have my assistant holding the light above my head by hand, again, because there's no point in putting it on a stand if you can't even fit the stands in there. And all I did this with was one small strip bank, and that's it. We used, 2 small strip banks. The second small strip bank was just that fill light from the other side. So again, that 2-stop under fill is a formula that I've just been using a long time, and I find it works well for what I like. It's not necessary for everybody, but for me, it just opens up the areas that I want some detail, and then once I get to post is where I can decide if I'm going to keep that detail or not. As I mentioned before, athletes, much like celebrities, can be a challenge. You know, sometimes you have hours to shoot them, and more often than not, it's bound to be a quick shoot. This image was part of a piece I did for Stack Media, covering a number of NFL hopefuls as they prepared for the NFL Combine. The assignment calls for me to shoot reportage of them working out in the gym, typically very dark gyms, but there's no lighting because they're also shooting video at the same time, so we can't have strobes going off. So in those cases, I'm really jacking up the ISO and just trying to focus my shots whenever the guys end up near a light or near windows or anything in those situations. Now, and this is quite often of the kind of work I do, I have to jump from that mindset to a portrait and make it look like a portrait that we've sat and studied for an hour or so. And in this case, I literally had 2 minutes with these guys before they left. They finished their workout, they're tired, they want to leave. I had actually brought lights, and I had a seamless background, and I had an assistant, and we were all ready to go. But because there was no time to even set it up, I had to go right to whatever I could come up with, right? Unlike California weather, typically it was actually overcast this day, so there's a little bit of luck in that. In reality, and I wanted to show this one that shows what it actually looks like on set, you can see the gym in the background there. That white wall is my background. And the reason I chose that white wall, one is because it was the only plain wall, but 2, I knew I could extend it. And it essentially had the same effect of having a white seamless out. So I fit my subjects on this space and just used natural light. And it was about 11:30 in the morning, so the sun was actually pretty high. So it was fortunate that it was overcast. If it wasn't overcast, I would have put him in the shade and done the same effect, but just have him on the shade side. And that's what I'll do in most of those cases when the sun is out, like in California normally. What you can see here, though, and again, it's the clues from the catch light, is that I used a small reflector underneath to bounce a little bit of light in, just so there's a little pop in the eyes. And again, that's just to kind of give that dimensionality to it, to give that kind of attractiveness that when we go to look at the picture, we have something that we're going for. Our eyes tend to go to the brightest thing in a picture, so when you're on white, it's a challenge to make sure that all the focus still goes on your subject. So by putting that little bit of light in the eyes, my intention is really to get people to look right at the eyes and move on from that. Since you asked a lighting question specifically about lighting, you get the bag. Sure. Enjoy it. Thank you.